This is Father Harvey Henderson at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Grand Forks. This is the sermon for the first Sunday in the Lenten season, the first of a six-part series I'm doing on the Passion narratives, chapters 18 and 19 in John's Gospel. So let me invite you to the first part of this Lenten preaching series. By passion here, I mean the suffering which Jesus endured during his arrest and trials and crucifixion, and not passion in the sense that we might think of it on an afternoon soap opera these days. I wanted to offer this series in part to respond to the rise of anti-Jewish sentiment in the United States, and this anti-Jewish material, which we can find in the New Testament, in the Gospels in particular, is there, and it needs indeed, I think, some clarification. So first, a few words about the Gospel of John itself. It's referred to as the fourth Gospel because it appears fourth in order in the New Testament. And when my boys were toddlers, Sesame Street was a popular television show. One of the skits I remember was called something like, "One of these things is not like the other." And so they would put 4 circles and a triangle in a row, and the toddlers were to identify which of the 5 was different. I think my son Donald would say he learned this skill rather well. So if we did that with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in their order of appearance in the New Testament, we would find that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar in their content and in their style. The order of the stories is similar in all 3 of those particular cases. Jesus speaks in parables and short stories and offers pithy one-sentence sayings that are easily memorizable by folks studying these particular Gospels. But if you were to take a look at the Gospel of John, you would see Jesus speaking there in whole chapters rather than in short stories and parables. The thinking is that the material in the Gospel of John reflects more the preaching of the early church around the end of the first century than it does the actual words of Jesus himself. And then, indeed, there is, however, at the heart of the Gospel, a story which is close to the original story, but it takes more skill than I have to detect that original story within this large Gospel. Here's roughly how the 4 Gospels came together. Mark almost certainly wrote first, probably in the mid-60s of the first century, probably in part because the eyewitnesses to the Jesus event were dying off. And then 20 years later, in the mid-80s of the first century, Matthew and Luke write their Gospels independent of one another, almost certainly, and each of them uses the Gospel of Mark as an outline, and they copy much of the material into their own accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus. They add some individual source material, one special source that Luke has and another that Matthew has. For example, Matthew's unique material would include the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6, and 7. And Luke's special source includes very familiar stories like the Good Samaritan, the Prodigal Son, and the Road to Emmaus story after the resurrection. At the risk of oversimplifying, Matthew is likely writing to a largely Jewish audience to convince them that Jesus is the promised Messiah. And Luke is likely writing to a more Gentile, non-Jewish audience to show that the Jesus movement has been part of God's plan from the beginning. Then sometime near the end of the first century or early second century, the Gospel of John comes to us in its present form, likely as the 3rd, or some might even say the 5th edition of what the original text was. I want to be clear that much of the material in the Gospel of John is the preaching of the early church and not literally the words of Jesus himself. This may come as news and maybe even a shock to some, but in the Episcopal Church, it's accepted theology to use our gift of reason and intelligence to read the text in a critical and historical way. So a few things about the Passion narrative as we begin. We will confine our study or our careful reading to chapters 18 and 19 of John's Gospel. This includes the arrest of Jesus, the trial before Jewish authorities, the trial before Roman authorities, and his execution and burial. And this leads up to what is the traditional Good Friday reading of the Passion narrative from John's Gospel. So chapter 18 begins after the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples. And John tells us that they journey across the Kidron Valley to a garden. He doesn't call it Gethsemane, nor does he tell us that it's on the Mount of Olives. I've not visited the Holy Land myself, but a little video research shows that the Kidron Valley was rather steep and wide, and that the journey from the meal in the city of Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives may have been 1 or 2 miles down and up the big valley. As a result, as a bit of an aside, this may explain the sleepiness of the disciples as portrayed in the other Gospels, although not in John. The first character we meet in John's account is Judas. And Judas we heard of already during the meal in chapter 13, where it reads that Satan had already entered into Judas and put upon him this betrayal of Jesus. Some have called this the necessary sin. If there was no betrayal, then there was perhaps no arrest, no crucifixion, no resurrection, etc. You get the idea. This idea that the betrayal was the work of Satan is what I mean when I talk that the battle of John's Gospel is between God and the forces of evil in the world. It's a kind of cosmic battle. We see from the opening lines of the Gospel, those lines we usually read aloud at Christmas time, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We could easily read this in some circles as in the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God. This prologue goes on to tell us that Jesus was sent by God the Father into the world to do battle with the forces of darkness. In verse 5, for example, we read that the light, Jesus, shone in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. With Judas, we meet a number of other characters. They are Roman soldiers, a lot of them, and police from the chief priests and the Pharisees. The Roman soldiers were there to protect the city and to deal with any kind of trouble that might occur during the time of Passover, when there were thousands of visitors to Jerusalem. The chief priests were the ruling elite of the city, and the work of the temple was their business. Many of them would be in collaboration with the Roman government to maintain their positions of power. The Pharisees we've met elsewhere in the Gospels. They are a group of what we might call religious fundamentalists who are often seen as arguing with Jesus about interpretations of the Jewish law, things like healing people on the Sabbath day. It's interesting to note that Jesus comes out to meet those who are there to arrest him. Historians tell us that it's likely they were meeting in a walled garden where Jesus was used to gathering with his friends. Hence, Judas knew the place well. This idea fits well with what Jesus tells us in chapter 10, and this is a key passion in understanding the Passion narrative, that Jesus lays down his life of his own free will, and no one takes it from him, not the Jewish authorities, not Pontius Pilate. This is a very different picture than is painted by the other 3 gospel traditions in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus is sometimes portrayed as the suffering servant, the one who, for example, cries aloud, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So it's important to note at this point that it is a small number of Jews, the temple leadership primarily, that are threatened by the popularity that Jesus has with the crowds. Jerusalem at Passover time is a bit like New Orleans at Mardi Gras. In a non-COVID year, thousands of people have gathered for the religious festival in Jerusalem and crowd control would have been important to Pilate, the Roman governor at the time. Arresting Jesus, who was popular with many of the people, might have been a time for trouble. In John's Gospel, the phrase "the Jews" is often used to refer to any particular group of Jews. In particular, in chapter 8, we read that the Jews have Satan as their father because they refuse to believe that Jesus is the promised Messiah. Well, many of the Jews did believe this. In fact, these were the followers of Jesus. This is an exaggeration. No doubt a small number of Jews can be implicated in the death of Jesus, most likely because of his recent action in the temple. You may recall the story of Jesus going into the temple, overturning the tables of the money changers, yelling and screaming about turning his Father's house into a den of thieves. The action would have been very offensive, particularly to the temple leadership. Later in this series, I will deal in more detail with the Jewish question. This morning, I'd like to focus more on this question about the cosmic battle. How do we see the role of evil in the world in which we live? Is there an active force of evil in the world working directly in opposition to the ways of God? Is there one called the devil who tempts us to do the things we ought not to do? In this 21st century world, sometimes this language seems a little strange, even to those of us in the church. One clue from today's gospel reading does suggest that the conflict in the gospel is a conflict between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. When those who come to arrest Jesus ask where he is, Jesus himself responds, "I am he." Well, actually, he just says, "I am." The pronoun he is added by the editors. On 7 other occasions in the gospel, Jesus uses the phrase to identify himself. For example, he says things like, "I am the light of the world," "I am the good shepherd," "I am the resurrection and the life." You may recall the Old Testament story of Moses and the burning bush. God speaking to Moses out of the burning bush and sends him back to Egypt to free the chosen people from Pharaoh. When Moses asks something like, "Whom shall I say sent me?" the response from God in the burning bush is, "I am who I am." The grammar is similar in the phrases used by Jesus in John's Gospel. Many scholars think that these so-called "I am" sayings in John's Gospel are clues to the identity of Jesus. And indeed, as the reader, we know from the beginning of the story that Jesus is a divine being sent from heaven to lead people to the light and to the truth. This has led one German scholar, a teacher of one of my teachers, to describe the Jesus portrayed in the 4th Gospel as a God striding upon the earth, a superhero kind of Jesus. John often contrasts the people who love the light over and against the people who prefer the darkness, and this is one of the descriptions of Judas in the gospel story. Jesus in today's gospel reading is pictured as standing not with Jesus and the disciples. There is no kiss, for example, that Judas uses to identify Jesus. Judas is standing with the Roman soldiers and the police. He has chosen the dark side, or perhaps we might say the dark side has chosen him. We are reassured in John's Gospel that Jesus has overcome the world. This does not mean that the demons of this world, cancer and viruses to name a couple, will not afflict us, but it does mean that the final victory belongs to God. Jesus lays down his life so that we might have eternal life. And he promises that when he is lifted up, and in John's Gospel, this lifting up includes the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension, he will draw the whole world to himself. "It is finished" is a shout of victory, a high five, a fist-pumping shout, I think. Jesus has accomplished what God sent him to do, to bring light to the world, a light which no darkness can overcome. Amen.